I had eye surgery. I had eye surgery last week. You can probably tell, you know, the signs of that over here. Luckily, my eye is now re-emerging and opening. So I'm very excited about that. And hopefully this will be the last of the eye surgeries. So what I want to do today is get right back into our discussion of the Silk Road. And I'm going to take us on, no pun intended, but a different turn on it in a little bit. But before I do that, I want to just very quickly ask you guys a few questions. And again, just like last time, I welcome and encourage your thoughts, questions, comments. Couple of ways to do that is by chat, by clicking on the chat and then typing in your questions or comments, and I'll try and keep watch of that. And then the other thing to do is you can use the raise hand, and you can find that on the bottom of the screen by looking at reactions. And I'll make sure I have the participant list up also, so that way I can see the raise hand. And also, if I'm just kind of taking a breather for a second, feel free to unmute and ask a question. So you can do it any of those three ways so that we can get everybody's input in this. Okay, so let's start with a few questions. I was going through the PowerPoint and I came up with a few things just to get us kind of warmed up and ready for this. So I'm going to type a word in here, and would you go into the chat and type what connotation you have with this word. So here comes the word, and just go into the chat, please, and put in just free association, the word that comes to mind when you see spice.
Potato.
Could be anything, but let's get some ideas.
That's in the chat. Go ahead.
Okay. Yep, you just have to go down into the chat and click on it. And then you just type your answer in. There's a few that are coming in. Let's see. Okay, interesting, interesting. Okay, we'll talk about these. These are all great. Okay. Yeah. All right. I'm going to start looking at a few of these, and then we'll see if some more of them come in. So the word is spice, and Liza mentioned India. India is integral to the story. So when we're talking about the Silk Road goes through Asia, but the Silk Road also has a maritime aspect, and that part is going to reach India. So India is huge when it comes to spices throughout history. Cinnamon was an extremely sought after spice. So that is very much part of the story of the Silk Road, and part of the Silk Road called the Spice Road. So we'll get to that. Certainly cooking. So spices and cooking, they go together. Throughout history, people wanted spices for flavoring. We'll get some more to that. Trade. Absolutely. Spices are at the core of global trade for the last 2,000 or so years. So we'll get into a discussion of that. From China, yep, there are definitely spices, very much sought after spices that had come from China. They were part of the Silk Road, the overland route, and also the maritime route for sure. And lively. Yeah, so when you think of something spicy, it kind of livens it up. So that's important for people, especially if they're coming from a part of the world where food is not too spicy and kind of dull. And then you can get a spice on food, and suddenly it becomes flavorful. So all of this is stuff to think about as we start continuing our discussion of the Silk Road. I want to ask you one other thing, because we're going to get into flavorings in this discussion. This thing is not exactly a spice. It's definitely a flavoring though. And I want to see if you can figure out where I'm going with this. So I'm putting a word in. that we all are aware of, and we all like to, make sure we're getting our payment from our salary and such. Can anyone, and you can put this into the chat again, can anyone identify a flavoring that is at the root of the word salary? I just discovered this today, and it's amazing. So don't peek at anyone's answers. We're no peeking going on here. Just think about it. And what do you think? Salary. This one was mind-boggling. And again, it's going to point to how important flavorings have been throughout history. All right. I see a couple of people are right on the mark. Crunchy. Okay. Here it is. And you got a couple of people picked up on it right away. The word is salt. So the Latin for salt is sal, right? Why is salary salt? Because the Romans, when they wanted to pay their soldiers, there were times that they paid them with slabs of salt. Salt was so valuable that people thought of that as, a worthy currency. So that's how we get the term salary today, coming from the Romans paying in salt. And that expression that he's worth his salt, that's where it's coming from. The fact that, he's pretty, he's pretty good guy. He's actually worth his salt, because salt is something that's really valuable. Okay, so with this in mind, this idea of flavorings and how important they are, and the Silk Road and the Spice Road, let's go to the share screen now. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, put your comments into the chat, or if it's a pause, if I'm not speaking for that moment, you can feel free to just speak your question out as well. All right, so off we go. And we're going to go into this PowerPoint that's going to go a little bit back to where we were last time, but it's also going to go forward with some new ideas. So we were talking about the Silk Road a couple of weeks ago, and we were saying how this was an ancient trade route that crossed through Central Asia from Xi'an, or in this case, they have an M at the end. And there were different ways that you could do this, but eventually, if you kept going, you could make your way to Rome. That was the ancient Silk Road. Now, here's an amazing thing going on today. China, as it becomes more and more powerful and economically dominant in many parts of the world, it's actually developing something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which many of you probably have heard of. And this is something that the present leader of China came up with a few years ago. And essentially what it's doing is recreating the Silk Road of the ancient past. And there are two parts of it. There's the overland part that we talked about last time. And again, it's starting from basically the same area. It would cross through Central Asia, and it would make its way through Iran, Istanbul, and then it would make its way into Western Europe. Because one of the problems that China has, and China always has had, is it's landlocked on this side. It does not have a coast. So if it wants to trade with the West, it's got to do it over land, if they're not choosing to do this kind of circuitous route. And that's one of the things that China is doing right now. They're developing deals with different countries along the way, just like in the past, to connect its goods with places like Western Europe. The other thing that China is doing, or they're attempting to do, is to redevelop what's called the Maritime Silk Road. And in this case, they're using the South China Sea. This is a real hotbed, international hotbed as far as conflict and issues and such, but they want to use the South China Sea, and through the South China Sea from Southeast Asia, the plan is to control or to use as many ports as they can in this area, so that eventually they can go up the Red Sea through the Suez Canal and again connect with Europe. So that would resolve some of the problem that they have of being landlocked on this side. And they have made leaps and bounds in making deals with different countries in order to do that. So what's fascinating about this is that this is almost exactly the same route that people took for thousands of years to connect East and West. This basically was the Silk Road, the land Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road. And we seem, it seems like history repeats itself. And that's what's going on once again. It's, instead of thinking of it in terms of from west to east, it's happening from east to west. And they're being quite successful in what they're doing. Does anyone have any questions or comments on this before I go on? Okay, so.
Judy, just
Yes.
a side question. Was that taxes by going through the different countries? Were they imposing taxes on product going from east to west?
Well, one of the ways that China has been so successful in manufacturing is that they will, I'm going to get my mouse, they'll flood other countries with goods. And it puts other manufacturing out of business. They did that in the United States, in our steel industry. So they will produce as much steel as they need to and send it over to the US, and we can't compete with that because our steel is owned by private businesses. So they can put them out of business very easily because in the case of China, it's a business government partnership. So the government will absorb the losses and allow, the prices to be lower for a while, and then they can knock out the competition. How they're getting these ports, though, is a little bit of a different thing. So let's say Colombo down here, which is Sri Lanka. What they'll do is they will go to Sri Lanka and say, we are going to build you a very modern port that you're going to be able to use. It will help your economy. It'll be a wonderful thing for you. We're going to lend you the money and we're going to build this beautiful port. All we ask in exchange is for you to pay us back little by little and for us to be able to use the port too. So what will end up happening invariably in many of these places, like in East Africa, Sri Lanka, and so on, is they are not able to pay China back. It's just too expensive. So it's actually a brilliant tactic because what they then do is they essentially control the port. They build the port, which is exactly what they wanted to do. Sure, the country can use it to some extent, but they're controlling it, so to speak. And if the country can pay them back, great. That's even better for them. But typically the country can't, and these countries end up in debt traps to China. It's an interesting situation. And actually, if we go back in history to China of, think of about when, the early 1400s, they were doing the same thing. They had a very powerful navy. They would go to different ports like in East Africa and such and trade for luxury items, but they made sure that everybody that they visited knew that they were, kind of the top dog. They always thought of themselves as the middle kingdom, the center of the world. And so all of these other countries or kingdoms that they dealt with at the time would have to have given them tribute. It's a similar principle to what's going on today. It's amazing how history ends up repeating itself. We seem to be going back into the same type of a cycle as at the apex of China's trade maritime-wise and overland. They're working on both right now, which is why I wanted to bring both into the mix. Thank you for bringing that question up. Mabel, I see your hand up.
Yes, I'm just wondering, you said that usually that country cannot pay back the debt.
Mm-hmm.
So that ports that China built, they own that port essentially.
Yeah.
And they can prohibit other countries from using that port if they wish to.
Sure.
And they could charge other countries the use of that port.
Absolutely. It's it's control. They're basically finding ways to control different areas without doing something as drastic or as inflammatory as what Russia's doing right now in Ukraine. That Russia's doing in Ukraine something which, we would consider very, kind of old fashioned. Besides it being horrible, it's old fashioned. That's kind of a brutal and awful and way that people would have invaded in the past. That's the way people look at it. Wow, we're still doing this in the 21st century. China, in my view, is essentially doing the same thing by controlling other places, but they're doing it without anyone being able to question it or raise an eyebrow, because they have a right to, build ports wherever they want. And nobody really, it's not a human rights issue. They're allowed to do it. And so quietly, they're moving further and further towards Europe so that they can have those same connections that would have existed going back 2,200 years ago even. It's quite an extraordinary thing that's going on. The one over here has always been very, very important. I was reading about this recently. This is in Djibouti. And you can see just geographically why this one is so vital. It's a choke point. It's a little opening between the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, the Horn of Africa area. You need to get through here to get up the Red Sea, to get to the Suez Canal, to get to the Mediterranean, right? So they want to make sure that, well, what their explanation is as to why they built a port there for Djibouti is so that they're keeping it free of pirates, because there is a huge piracy issue here. But the other edge of this is that they then will control it. Now, at this point, international law would not allow them to close it off. They would not be able to do that, to close off a port like that, or I mean, a choke point like this. But it's kind of an iffy thing to have an authoritarian country like China have control over this vital area. So, these issues that exist today are, again, very similar to the types of things that would have happened throughout history when different powers controlled areas that would have been vital links. I'll show you another one that throughout history has been very important. So I'm going to travel down to this area. So notice that this is another sea route over here.
Indonesia.
This is Indonesia over here, and Malaysia is up here, and there's another very significant place at the very tip here called Singapore. Okay, so Singapore is a very important trade area, and it makes sense that it should be, because Singapore is right at the tip of the Malaysian peninsula. It's kind of at the linchpin, the elbow, I think of it as, between the South China Sea, which is a very important, and always has been a very important sea lane, and this little area over here, which is called the Strait of Malacca. And the Strait of Malacca, there is a quote saying that whomever controls the Strait of Malacca controls the world. That's going back to like the 1300s that people were saying that, because if you could control this port, this strait, this little narrow opening, you controlled vital traffic in connecting India, this part of the world, and China. And why would this be important as opposed to going around? Because up until recently, boats did not want to be on the open ocean. So if they had a way to get through a protected little strait like that, they absolutely were going to use it. Even today, this is a highly traveled strait. It's extremely important. But if you go back to, let's say, the 1400s, boats would have not been interested in crossing the open Indian Ocean. They would have wanted to cut through here and then go up to China, Japan, etc. Instead. So the control of this area is vital. It's really vital to the connections going on, again, between East and West. And I'll keep, you know, I'm gonna, like a broken record, I'll keep saying that history just continues to repeat itself. Let's see what Liza's saying. Was the Maritime Silk Road created in response to the rise of the Ottoman Empire and their closing off of the Black Sea? Great question. So this Maritime Silk Road or Spice Road, however we want to look at it, it existed before the Ottomans. The Ottomans are coming on strong in, let's say, the 1300s, the 1400s, like that. There had been trade going on in this area since at least the time of the ancient Greeks. The Greeks had not reached China, but they reached India, believe it or not. The Romans also reached India. So this was going on for about 2,000 years. At the time of the Ottoman Empire, there are other things that are really important that's going to start happening. When the Ottoman Empire, I'm going to just let somebody in that I see up there. When the Ottoman Empire takes Istanbul, okay, so Constantinople becomes Istanbul at that point. They then are controlling this very important passageway, another choke point, just like we talked about before. Choke points are everything. They are so significant in history. So when the Ottoman Empire in the, thinking of when it was the early 1400s, about 1450, I believe, they took this area and they controlled Constantinople. Once that happens, they are controlling access to the Black Sea, which is going to make it harder and harder for others like the Venetians to get in there, to reach the Silk Road. So the fascinating thing is that one thing always leads to another. Where there's a will, there's a way. People were so interested in Europe in getting goods that had been coming from the Silk Road that they were very creative and they came up with a plan B. Number one, the people of Western Europe could not stand Venice because Venice was the middleman that brought goods from Asia to Europe. So you can imagine how exorbitant the profits they put onto goods were. It was absolutely crazy. So they were completely hated. They were called extortionists and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so what will happen is after this gets closed off, Venice is thinking, uh-oh, we're going to be in big trouble now. But they had some deals with the Ottomans that they were still able to trade. However, powers in Western Europe said, we are totally fed up now with dealing with Venice. We're not going to be able to get through on our own. We got to come up with a plan B. Does anyone know what the plan B might have been? And I'm going to write down in here what power specifically came up with plan B. It's like one thing in world history leads to another. It's quite an amazing thing. This is the power, Portugal. Does anybody know what Portugal's decided to do? Because the Ottomans took Constantinople and Venice was a bunch of extortionists and they didn't want to deal with them anymore and getting goods from Asia.
They went around the Cape of Good Hope.
Exactly. So they said, you know what we're going to do? Little by little, we're going to figure out the shape of Africa. We don't know what it is. It might end about over here. We have no clue. They really had no idea. None of the Western Europeans in the 1400s had been much further south than about Morocco, believe it or not. It was a new world for them completely. And little by little, the Portuguese kind of crept down the coast, one expedition after another. Some of them were afraid that they were going to burn up when they got to the equator, because that's what the theory always had been. And they, little by little, they kept going. In the 1480s, Bartholomew Diaz made it to the Cape. So he knew that that was the point where Africa ends. He then went back. His crew said, no more, no mas, we're done. And he had to go back. They were going to mutiny otherwise. So it's going to take a few more years. Vasco da Gama, who you probably have heard of from history class, he's the Portuguese sailor who's going to go all the way around Africa, and he's going to make it to India, and it brings up the mention of India before. India was always such a wealthy and valuable place because of, number one, its location. It's kind of right in the middle of the action here. And also because of the things that it could grow. India is tropical. And when you have a tropical climate, there's a huge, typically a huge diversity of biology. And one of the very important things that India had were spices. And so the first step was the Portuguese getting here. And once they got here and established trade with the Hindu kings that were along the coast on this side, they didn't stop there. They said, you know what we're going to do now? We're going to figure out where the other spices are that we never could reach before, that the Venetians were selling to us at exorbitant rates. And they weren't quite sure where they were, but little by little, the Portuguese figured out the route, and it was to go through the Strait of Malacca, and many spices that are extremely valuable in the 1200s through even today, but 1200s to, let's say, 1600s, were located in this part of Indonesia. And at that time, it wouldn't have been called Indonesia. It was, I don't know what it would have been called at that time. It was different kingdoms and such. And there's an area, I can't see it because I got my list up here, but hopefully you can see kind of where my arrow is right now. There are islands called the Spice Islands that are very close to the island of New Guinea. And that's where they eventually reached. So the Portuguese were the ones that basically cracked the code. They figured out the secret that was being held from the Western Europeans in reaching the maritime Silk Road, or the Spice Road, or the maritime spice route. Any of those are interchangeable. So go west. Okay, so then the other thing, of course, is you could go west, sure. So another creative thing, so you have a plan B, and that's to go around Africa. Plan C is, since the Portuguese were already going this way, was to try to go that way, to go westward. And again, you all know this, that Christopher Columbus, he didn't know about the Americas. He's going in the western direction because he thinks that the earth is much smaller than it actually is. And he also believed that much of the earth was made up by land. We know today that planet Earth is about 70% water. But at that time, people may have thought it was kind of the flip of that. So his idea is, I'm going to go westward, and in a short period of time, I'm going to reach this area over here. And that way I'm going to outsmart those nasty Portuguese, and I'm going to have the best route of all. And it was really all to connect Western Europe finally with parts of the Silk Roads, the maritime Silk Roads and the overland Silk Roads. If you live in this part of Western Europe in the 1400s, this is a real backwater. It's hard to imagine because Europe becomes so powerful because of all of these explorations and such, and the dominance in trade that ends up happening. But in the early 1400s, or the time of Columbus, 1492, this is a backwater area. This is where much of the wealth of the world is. It's going to be in India. It's going to be in China. This area is very important as far as wealth goes, and up here. So if you live in Western Europe in the 1400s, you are desperate to get into this huge global trade network. And finally, Portuguese and then the Spaniards were able to do it. So it is quite the tale that is very much in many ways like what we're seeing today. It, kind of a different way, a different angle, but same idea of connecting East and West is what China's doing today. Anybody have other questions on this? Okay, I'm looking to see what Mabel wrote here. Okay, it's interesting how China is using a backdoor approach to it. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, from us, it's a backdoor approach. For them, it's their only way. But it seems to us like, you know, kind of like going through this open, less settled area to reach Europe, because our way of thinking of Europe is, yeah, we just crossed the Atlantic and there we are. But this is, they don't have many other choices except to use the same idea as the Silk Road, or to use the maritime. And this has always been, their geography has always been a problem for them, because they are so far from some of the other areas, the other economic centers in the world, but they seem to be overcoming that to a certain degree. One of the other things I want to mention while I have this map up, you can't really see it from this, but another thing that is discussed is, and this one involves Russia. So Russia very much is banking on being able to use what they call the northern route, the northern sea route up here on the Arctic Ocean. So right now it's basically unusable. There are times where there's enough ice melt that icebreakers can get through and such, but they are kind of, you know, expecting that the climate is going to get warmer and that eventually this is going to be a navigable route. Whether that happens or not, don't know, but they hope that it is, because then suddenly Russia becomes a major player as far as trade goes up here. And an interesting thing is that China is very much investing in infrastructure and such up here, because they're really hoping that they can use the Arctic Ocean, because that would give them an alternative by boat that would be a lot easier than all of this. Look at this whole crazy thing that they have to do in order to get to Western Europe. If they could actually use the Arctic Ocean, they could head off from, you know, the Beijing area and just kind of flip around. So who knows if that's going to become a new version of a Silk Road in the future. But right now it's still very iffy. There was actually an attempt to do this for a ship to go through last November, and it ended up getting completely frozen in. So that was the end of that plan for Russia. But they are definitely trying that, and you can see why. I mean, economically, that would be an explosion for Russia if they could actually navigate the Arctic Ocean for a decent amount during the year. I saw some comments coming in. Let's see what we got. Strange how this may influence their position on global warming. Sure, yeah. I mean, you know, there's a definite interest for them in there being a thaw in the Arctic Ocean. Absolutely, they would be the big winners. I mean, probably in some ways Canada also, because of the huge coastline that they have. But China loves the idea and has been doing major investments up here in, you know, different icebreakers. I think they brought some icebreakers in to help out Russia. So they're looking all over the place, different ways that they can connect themselves to the West is certainly going to help them economically. It's quite an amazing thing. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think we covered all the questions and comments. Thank you for those. Let's move on and see what else we got here. All right, so I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to get my chat back down here. I'm going to talk about the Maritime Silk Road. And so then by focusing on the Maritime Silk Road, I really did put spices up, because that's going to become one of the major motivators in using the water routes. So let's take a look at what we've got here. Just as a quick backup from last time, I want to show you what we're focusing on. So if we really go back in time to about 10,000 years ago, one of the earliest places where agriculture is going to develop will be China. The earliest is Mesopotamia. China is a close second. It comes in very soon after Mesopotamia, with the Nile Valley in Egypt as well. So this was an area that developed thousands and thousands of years ago. And one of the things that will start to occur is the idea of dynastic leaders. And the Han Dynasty, which I mentioned last time, will be a very influential dynasty in China that's actually going to extend its rule quite far to the west. Another empire that exists at the time of the Hans are the Romans, which makes it so fascinating because we really have two, major empires in history at the same time, and they indirectly started to make contact with each other. We don't know if any Roman expeditions actually made it to China, but certainly there was an interest in Rome for Chinese goods. And okay, I'm going to go past this stuff. One of the things, going back to the idea of China being such an ancient civilization, there were techniques that developed there thousands of years ago that were unique. And one of them is called sericulture, which is the art of developing silk. You can do it anywhere, but they figured out exactly how to do this, and it became a fine art. So essentially you need a mulberry bush and you need silkworms, and this was work that was typically done by women. This was considered a woman's job, and silk was created. Well, over time, people in the West are going to start learning about this. The Romans find out about silk in, we'll say, about the year 100 AD. They are in love with it. They never had seen anything like this before. And thus becomes this relationship east-west, I'm going to go past this, between the Hans and the Romans. And here they are. So the Romans and the Hans, they're quite distant from each other, but there's going to be enough middlemen and such that will carry goods from one to the other. And I think I mentioned last time that one of the perfect matches for the Silk Road was the Bactrian camel. So these are camels that have two humps, and they're ideally suited for the arid climate of Central Asia, and also the changes in temperature that go on, the hot and the cold. So this was basically the freight trains that would carry goods from China to the Romans or vice versa. And this is a depiction of the silk that people were wearing in the Roman Empire. They were in love with it. It was so popular that the Emperor Octavian, Augustus, he actually made a law to limit the use on wearing silk, because he said that it was too see-through, and he thought that it was just too immodest. He did not like it at all. So he was trying to stop people from wearing it, but he could not do that. It was a craze. People were not going to be stopped. One of the interesting things about this is that by the time the silk came to the Romans, it was so expensive because it's coming all the way from China, that what weavers would do would be to unthread it and then rethread it so that it was thinner. And because of that, it became very transparent and, quite immodest. So there was a big outcry about that, but there was no way to stop the Romans from doing it. They wanted their silk. Okay, and that's just an example of some of the beautiful artistry that China was able to do with silk. Okay, so, and we've talked about some of these places last time. Some of the cities that became quite successful were Bukhara and Samarkand and Tashkent. And one of the interesting things that will occur is that in about the 900s, they will become Muslim. So today, Central Asia is predominantly Islamic. Before that, though, there were lots of other religious influences that came through, one of which was Buddhism. I think we talked a little bit about this last time. Buddhism came from the India area, and it swung through Afghanistan and came through Central Asia. a really tragic thing that happened when the Taliban came into power in Afghanistan was that there were huge Buddhist statues. This is going back, I think, to the early 2000s. Huge Buddhist statues that were carved into cliffs in Afghanistan. Does anyone know what the Taliban did to those Buddhist statues?
Not too bad.
They blew them up. Yeah, they said this is sacrilegious. They literally blew them up. They had been there since about the 900s. So it was a real tragedy that happened. But what it's showing is that this really was, the crossroads of the world during that period, where people from different religious influences and such were all making money. They were all moving goods through this area to make money. And to put in perspective where we are, this is the Caspian Sea. Russia would be north of here. The Black Sea is over there. Think about where Western Europe is. It is way out of, kind of the main interchange of Eurasia. It's really the backwater in the 900s, 1000s, 1200s. It is backwater compared to what's happening in Asia, amazingly enough. It is so interesting to see how things change in history, because today people would say, well, this area is not really, the center of trade. Well, it was at one time for sure, and it was not Western Europe. Okay, and some of the major cities that popped up during that period were right here in present-day Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so on. Again, Caspian Sea is over here. And I'll just show you some pictures of these places and some of the absolutely spectacular mosques that would be built in places like Tashkent. These are all Silk Road trading cities. And Bukhara and Samarkand. So they all end up dominant by Islam. That's going to happen in about the 900s. Okay, and I think we talked about a little bit about this last time. I think food history is just a fascinating part of, kind of the human experience. And interesting to note that a lot of the foods that we eat today come from Central Asia. So from the Silk Road, they're going to move westward, and they also move on to China as well. So Central Asia really is this kind of, middle ground, and things could travel east or west. And so pomegranates and apples and walnuts and apricots and all that are originating from Central Asia. Okay, I'm going to go past that and just mention one other thing, and then we'll get into the maritime. So there's a very important place called the Fergana Valley, which is in today's Uzbekistan. And the Silk Road really began because the Han Chinese, in about the year, let's say 100 BC or so, were desperately seeking high quality horses. And we talked about last time that horses, modern horses, are coming from Central Asia. The Chinese desperately needed good horses so they could fight off the nomads that were all around them. This place, for whatever reason, it's a fertile valley, had some of the finest horses. So the Chinese brought garrisons as far west as this area in today's Uzbekistan in order to get horses, to get these fine horses that come from this place. So that's really the beginnings of the Silk Road. And once they got there, they witnessed all of the different products that were available, and they thought, perfect, we're going to start slowly but surely trading with some of these places in Central Asia, and Central Asia started to trade more and more so with the Middle East. And I think I saw a message on here. Let me just double check. No, okay, good. So let's keep going. Other unique things coming from East Asia. Well, we can't move on without focusing just a little bit on porcelain. Porcelain is another thing that was a specialty in China. And it's very interesting to find out, well, what was so special about China that this became the center of porcelain making. they have the ingredients that one would need in order to create it. You need a certain kind of clay, and you need this type of stone. Both of them are in China. And with that, they created these magnificent objects. Now, one of the problems with porcelain is that, of course, it's quite breakable. So there wasn't a lot of this that was transported over land. This was something that would be shipped by the maritime route. So once the maritime route was established, China was able to make even more money because breakable objects like this would not have done well on a camel. So this is, kind of what's developing over time, over hundreds and hundreds of years in trade from east to west. Now, let's see what else we've got. Okay, this is just giving a, what would happen is if you had something special and you didn't want to let people know how to duplicate it, there would be all kinds of fanciful explanations. So in 1557, somebody in Europe offered this explanation on the creation of porcelain. Eggshells and shells, umbilical fish pounded into dust, which are mingled with water and shaped into vases. Like basically nobody had any idea how to do this. And the Chinese had kept it a secret for a very long time. So people in Western Europe could not duplicate it. Same thing happened with silk. It was capital punishment if anyone gave away the secret of creating silk. It's not going to reach the Europeans probably until about the year 900 or so, when they start creating their own silk. They had a monopoly and they wanted to keep that monopoly. Oh, sure. Thank you for coming. Take care. Okay, so now comes the big question. So there were lots of desirable and rare items in the ancient era. Why were metals, gems, silk, and spices some of the main items? What do they all have in common? Why were all of these some of the top luxury items of the Silk Roads or the maritime route? Does anybody see anything that they all have in common? And one of them in particular, oh my goodness, it's fantastic. It's perfect as a shipping item. What do you think? Metals, gems, silks, and spices. Why are they perfect items to ship? Why are they perfect luxury items?
They're not breakable.
So one of the things is that they're not breakable. So the porcelain was a problem. They had to be really careful about shipping that, right? That would be very, very expensive to ship. Small to ship? Yeah, a lot of these things would have been smaller, and they are not breakable. So metal and gems and silk and spices, you're not going to break them. Another thing that's important about all of this stuff is that it is not going to spoil. It's not perishable. So remember we were talking before about the apples and the pomegranates. That's really not something that you can use as a trade item. It's going to go bad very quickly. But these are all things that you can ship and it's not going to be a problem. Now, spices are really special for a whole bunch of reasons. You definitely can ship them without them spoiling. I mean, the whole idea of a spice as a preservative means that it's not spoiling, right? So you can keep spices for a really long time. But now I want to ask you, okay, we talked about the association with spice. So now I want to ask everybody this question. Why would spices be so special to people in Western Europe? Why would they go to the ends of the earth for spices? Can you put that into the chat? Whatever your reason is, what is so special about spices? What is special about spices? Let's see. And there are, I can think of at least 6 major reasons, or probably even more than that. So let's see. Why are spices so special? And actually the word spice, it comes from especial, special. So it's something unique and special. Okay, let's see what we've got here. All right, there's some good ones coming in. Good, good, good. All right. So let's start from the top. Feel free to put more of them in as I go. I'm going to go back to what Joyce wrote before about small to ship. I know you wrote that about the other thing, but we can definitely apply that to this idea in particular. Spices can pack up and you can use really every space, right? It's not like porcelain where you're going to have this dead space. It's all packed really tightly, so you can get a lot in there in a small space. That's important. No refrigeration, so spiciness is a good thing, absolutely. So if you don't have refrigeration in the 1400s, spiciness is a good thing. It might keep things fresher longer. It did not cover up spoiled food. Nobody was eating spoiled food. I remember hearing about that when I was a kid in school. Nobody ate spoiled food. They would have gotten just as sick as we would get today, but it could preserve the food longer when you don't have refrigeration. So that was really important. Good taste, flavor, absolutely. Now think of Western Europe. It's not a place that has spices. The food tends to be more bland. So can you imagine being able to put spice on your food? This is very exciting, extremely exciting at that time. Flavor, preservative, and easily portable. Excellent preservative of food. Okay, so all of these are absolutely on track. There are other reasons as well. Does anyone want to throw a few more in before we kind of let the cat out of the bag on some other things? Think about other connotations of spices. Anything else come to mind? Okay, I'm going to show you a few because it's just incredible how important these were in history. So throughout European and Asian history, the lure of spices and other luxury goods has been at the heart of trade and exploration. And let's see what we're looking at here. Oh, you know what? While I have this slide up, I was looking to see what I wanted to show. One of the interesting things that was going to prompt the spice trade, which would have originally been from Alexandria to these areas in India, was something very unique about the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is governed by the monsoon. So what that means is monsoon, everyone thinks of rainfall, but the other important thing about bless you, are winds. So
Currents.
Exact currents, yes, and winds. So there's a seasonal wind that goes in this direction, and then it changes and it goes in this direction. Now, if you're going on the Atlantic and the Pacific, you don't have this boost that changes half the year in, but you have that on the Indian Ocean. So early on, that was a big help for sailors to be able to cross the Indian Ocean. They use the southwest monsoon to go in this direction. They hang around a little bit, and then they use the northeast monsoon to come back. So the Indian Ocean is a much more navigable ocean than the others. So that number one is going to be very helpful. So I wanted to throw that into the mix. And let's see what else we have here. So this is the Asian spice trade before the Europeans. So people had been poking around in Southeast Asia for quite a long time, before the 1400s when the Portuguese get there. All of these are routes that China and the Malaysians and others would have taken in the spice trade. I want to show you exactly where the spice islands are, and then we'll get to some of the other uses for them. So these islands, this grouping of islands over here, are called the Spice Islands. It doesn't mean that all the spices in the world grow there. There are plenty of other types of spices that grow in different areas in this general region, but these specific islands had some of the most sought after spices, and this area remained a secret to the Western Europeans, again, until the Portuguese were able to break through. The spices that came from this little tiny area are cloves, nutmeg, and mace. Those three, they were like the big three. They were kind of called the heavenly spices. Everybody wanted them. And a bag of cloves would have been far more valuable than a bag of gold during this period. And just by looking at the nature of this, it kind of makes sense. This is so out of the way compared to Western Europe. So it becomes more and more valuable because of the difficulty in getting it. So this brings up another reason why spices were so important. The mere fact that it was very difficult to get them made them scarce, made them really expensive. Why would that then make them attractive? What do you think they were used for if they were a scarce item in Western Europe? Who do you think would have used them?
The king.
Royalty.
Yeah, I mean, it was a way to show off. The way you think of people who have like a big diamond or a jaguar today. If you could have a banquet with cloves and other spices, it was conspicuous consumption. Just the mere fact that you had spices was a major way to show off to everybody else. So that was another reason why spices were so valuable. Some of the big ones are coming from this little tiny area. And in order to get them to Western Europe, they've got to go up the Strait of Malacca. They have to come around here, up the Red Sea to Alexandria. And then the Venetians would come down to Alexandria and bring them to Western Europe. I mean, it's unbelievably expensive. So people would use it to show off, essentially. Let's see some other things that are interesting in this story. This, by the way, is one of the spice islands. This is a spice island called Ternate. And there's a reason why very unique foods or spices can grow in a place like this. And this picture kind of gives you some of the suggestion of it. This is a volcanic island in Southeast Asia. A lot of Southeast Asia is quite active tectonically. And these are basically islands that are made up of volcanoes. So when you have a volcano and it spouts out its ash and lava, it's going to fertilize the soil. So one of the things that's going on in the Spice Islands is that there's very fertile soil here. Another thing that's happening is there's lots of rainfall. This is in the tropics. So there's a lot of rainfall as well. So if you put the two of them together, warm, rainy, very fertile soil, this is the perfect place for the spices to grow. So this would have been, this little island would have been the center of attention for thousands of years. There were a few others like these in that group that also would grow the cloves, the nutmeg, and the mace. The Malaysians, the Chinese, the Arabians, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and the Spanish were all vying to control this area. That's how sought after and how rare the things that grew here were. Okay, I'm going to go past that and let's look at some of the other things. So so what is special about spices? Let's look at a couple of quotes and some other stuff. Okay, instructions for parish priests. Hast thou smelled anything to your liking, meat, drink, or spicery that after you have sinned by? So in other words, this priest is saying that this is kind of sinful, the using spices. And when you think of it, spices are sometimes, there's kind of a connotation of something kind of not, kind of a little off color, right? So something spicy is maybe not that kosher, that proper. And that's where you get something like Spice TV, right? I mean, it's a little, maybe a little not G-rated. So where does that come from? It's actually coming from the idea that spices were an aphrodisiac.
Aphrodisiac, yeah.
Okay, so let's put that on the list. Not only are they all the things that you listed, but they were conspicuous consumption because of how far away they were, but they were also used in love potions. Haha. So that's going to be a main attraction for people as well, to get them to put into, you know, a little of this and a little of that, and you can make a little bit of a love potion. Not only that, let's see what else we have. Well, if we go back to the time of the Greeks and the Romans, actually Galen is Roman. Galen is Roman. Looking at the date, Galen is Roman? Yes, Galen is Roman. So Greek and Roman medicine, one of the interesting things that remained in medicine for actually like 2,000 years, pretty much, is the idea of the humors, that our body is made up of 4 different humors. And that's how we get the term. I'm going to write it down. When you think of good humor, when somebody has a very good humor, well, think of where that's actually coming from. It's coming from this idea of your humors being in balance. So there was this idea that we had hot, wet, cold, and dry. And in order for someone to be healthy, you had to keep your humors in balance. If they weren't in balance, that's when you get sick. So spices played into this way of looking at medicine as well, because spices would have been considered hot. That makes sense. And so if you were not doing well and you were sick in a certain way and a doctor said, oh, that's because you don't have enough of your hot humors, spices could help you. So spices were integral to medicine as well. Aphrodisiac, medicine, and all the other things we've been talking about so far, and more as well. Oh, and by the way, before I get away from this slide, can anybody, by thinking about these 4 humors, can anybody think of a term that we still use today to describe when we're not feeling so great based on these humors? It's a certain virus that we can have, and it comes directly from this idea of the 4 humors. If we have what?
Flu.
Kind of like the flu, but it actually is directly related to this. Norma, I think I know what you mean. Did you leave out a letter? You left out a letter, right? Okay, here it is. Norma got it. And yeah, there we go. All right. Cold. Anyone who has a cold ever, why do we call it a cold? Guess why? Because it has to do with your humors being out of whack. So there was too much cold going on, and that's why you would have that virus that then became a cold. So it's crazy to think that things that we say today relate back to medicine of, you know, like 2,000 years ago or whatever. And by the way, this still went on until 1858, as insane as it is. People were still doing things like bleeding and other things, yeah, until like the beginning of the 20th century even. All of that related to this idea of the Hippocratic Hellenic form of medicine. So spice is going to be important to keep your humors in order. And let's see what else we can come up with here. All right, well, we already talked about the aphrodisiac, that they were, you know, you certainly needed those. And spices certainly would be a love potion in order to keep people, you know, to help somebody to, you know, get a crush on somebody else. And let's see what else. Here's some others. There was something called a miasma theory that was popular during the Middle Ages. And if you look at this mask, this is the type of mask that people would wear during pandemics, kind of like the Black Plague that occurred. They would wear these really creepy looking masks, these kind of bird beak masks. And they would put spices and flowers in the beak, because the theory was that people got sick because of bad air. So if you could clean the air with spice and flowers, then that could keep you healthy as well. So once again, the idea of spices comes into the picture as something that people really want to have. And while we're on that topic, I want to just mention another one to you that has to do with this miasma theory. Can anybody think of a sickness that people literally attributed to bad air, to the point that they named it for bad air? They believe that people got it because of bad air. Can you think of the sickness? It's literally in the name. I love this stuff. Oh, Norma, that's interesting. Asthma, I don't think, I'm not sure where asthma comes from. That's not the one I was thinking of. Norma, you're on to the, you're getting the names of sicknesses awards today. You got it. Malaria, everybody, look at malaria with a new look.
Foul air.
It means bad air. Isn't that amazing? So the idea was that you would catch malaria by breathing in swamp gases or bad air. So if you could have a bunch of spices to breathe in, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. That's what people were looking to do. So look at all of the uses for spices. It just goes on and on and on. Here's another one that I found out about, and that would be preservatives for people too. So mummies were, there were spices put on the bodies in order to keep the person preserved. And so we find lots of spices as part of the mummification process of the kings in ancient Egypt. And here goes some more. And just when we thought that spices were kind of in the gutter with all that, you know, sexy stuff like the spice TV and all that, and aphrodisiacs, they also are holy. So I'm going to show you this one. This is used at the end of the Jewish Sabbath, Shabbat. And people are going to burn spices in here as an official end to the Sabbath each week. So spices can be holy, and they also can be profane. And they have lots of other uses as well. And part of that is why people would literally go to the ends of the earth in order to get them. This is an interesting one. So the Romans would have these huge feasts. If you were a wealthy Roman, you know, you would just have these tremendous feasts that would go on for hours and hours and hours. Looks like they need better table manners. I don't know what's going on down here. And one of the things that they would do is lavish the food with spices. One of the favorite spices of the Romans was pepper. They really, really loved pepper. Okay, so we went past that. I want to mention this, that by the time that spices reached the Romans and then later the Europeans, they passed so many middlemen that the price increased by 1,000 or more %. That's definitely impetus for the Portuguese and others to kind of get on with it in the 1400s to find their own route to the Spice Islands. And let me show you, okay, we looked at some of this already. I'm going to go past there. Okay, I want to show you a little bit of India. So India, a lot of India is tropical or subtropical. And that's one of the reasons why India has such a variety of spices themselves. So there are the spices of the Spice Islands. There's also spices that come from Sri Lanka. There are spices that come from other parts of Southeast Asia and China and India itself. So it's that part of the world that had what everybody wanted, and they knew it, and they were very prominent because of that. Okay, and so who are the stars of the show? Cinnamon. Cinnamon is from Sri Lanka. And that is a very interesting picture of Sri Lanka. and pepper. And pepper is actually coming from India originally, nutmeg and mace and cloves, which are coming from the Spice Islands. And I want to just show you the difference between spices and herbs. So spices are all of the other parts of the plant. The herb is the green part of the plant, and it's coming from temperate areas. So you're not going to have spices in the tropics. Okay. Stop me if you have any questions on any of this stuff. And I want to just show you a list of some of the things that are native to South Asia that would have been part of the Maritime Silk Road. So you just can see this long list of interesting things that Europeans did not have unless they traded with South Asia. Citrus fruits, and so on. And then the Mediterranean. These are some of the native foods that were part of the trade situation going on. A very valuable one was saffron. Saffron is coming from North Africa. And if you know anything about it, it blooms for a very short time and you have to hand pick it. So it's very, very expensive. Even today, saffron is extremely expensive. And Southeast Asia, these are some of the things that are native to that area. Ginger is one that is very popular today, and there are the cloves. And China had some of its own that the Western Europeans would have been interested in. And Europe, on the other hand, had these foods. It does not have the same variety because it's not tropical. And so the growing season is not going to be as long. There just isn't the variety. But these are some of the important foods that would be native to Europe. Okay, so Alexandria became the major port during the time of the Romans in order to bring the spices to Europe. And this is the famous lighthouse that existed there. In the 400s, Alexandria is established as this, major post of bringing items from the east to the west. And the only Europeans that were allowed eventually to reach this port would be the Venetians. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. I want to just tell you a little bit about this. So zeroing back in on China, China has a tremendous maritime history that amazingly is going to end abruptly in the early 1400s. But until that time, China would venture, just like they're looking to do now, they would venture on the Pacific coast to go to some of these important trade areas. And I want to zero in on this individual. His name is Zheng Ha, and I'll spell it for you. He was the admiral of the Chinese treasure fleet. His job was to go with a fleet of ships and reach foreign ports and set up trade relations with different places. He went as far as the Red Sea and East Africa. And that should sound familiar because it's exactly the route that the Chinese are using today in the Belt and Road Initiative. The ships that he took were so sophisticated in the early 1400s that they were able to grow their own food, and they did not have to stop as frequent as the Europeans would have to make, to get food and water. They were really well equipped, growing fresh vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't know anything about how a person would catch scurvy, but by growing their own food, they prevented scurvy. So people were eating vitamin C and they were staying healthy. So they were way ahead of the Western Europeans in their time. Interesting story about this admiral. He had been captured when he was a boy from Central Asia. And he was taken into the king's court, and because he was so talented, he became the admiral in the Navy. So he actually started off as potentially a slave, but then ended up somebody of such prominence. I want to show you some of his voyages, just like what we were talking about before. I mean, it's almost exactly the same map as the Belt and Road Initiative today. So he and his voyages, and these are the years that they went on the voyages in the early 1400s. He's coming down the South China Sea, hotbed today politically. There's a lot of contentiousness going on in this part of the world. And he would make stops in different places to trade, to get exotic goods to bring back to China, and also to let all of these places know that China is the top dog. They are the top dog. Everyone needs to go to China or to give tribute to the Chinese emperor. So he's asserting the authority of China in addition to setting up trade relations, very much like today. So, you know, again, that theme of history repeating itself. Oh, by the way, another interesting word that we use today that harkens back to this time. The emperor was considered godlike, you know, much like the ancient Egyptians would have thought of their pharaoh as a god. People had to be completely, you know, deferential to the emperor, of course, when they would meet them. One of the things that you would have to do, let's say you were coming from Borneo and you were meeting up with the Chinese emperor, you would have to go down on the ground and bang your head to show submission to the emperor. Does anybody know what that term is? We use it today to show complete submission. What were people doing when they were banging their head to the emperor? Does anybody know what that word would be? And in English, that would be, you know, it's a very derisive term when it's showing that you're, you know, you have complete submission to somebody. People often say, I'm not gonna to that person. Oh, some people got it. All right, great. Kowtow. Kowtow is a Chinese word, and it means just that. The kowtow was when these different leaders were taken to meet the emperor, and they would have to kind of be prostrate on the floor and literally bang their head on the ground. And that's why today people say, I'm not going to kowtow to him, because yeah, it's that same meaning that has been retained. So Zheng Ha, he did all of this. He went all the way to East Africa, to the Red Sea, et cetera, et cetera. The amazing thing is that he comes back in 1415 to China with all of these luxurious items and all kinds of visitors and such. And there is a changeover in leadership. And he is told, guess what? We're not doing this anymore. We are not spending money on these voyages. And instead, we're going to dismantle these ships. And in fact, because we don't want anyone doing this anymore, we are burning most of the records. And that's exactly what they did. There are very few of the records of his voyages left. They've had to kind of be put together by little pieces and such, and hearsay and this and that. So they literally dismantled this whole operation that was going on. China was preeminent in the sea at that time. They were also the most powerful place, very wealthy and powerful, ancient place that had such a head start over those folks at the other edge of the world in Western Europe. But amazingly, without realizing what effect that could have, they kind of closed up shop and became much more isolationist and ended this maritime Silk Road operation that they were doing at the very time that Western Europe was getting fed up with the Venetians and the Ottomans. And that's when the Portuguese, under Prince Henry the Navigator, is going to start encouraging sailors to go down the coast of Africa. So little did they know that there was going to be a new kid on the block. Just when they're retreating, it's incredible. They're starting up. And I often wonder, what would have happened if the Portuguese rounded Africa and encountered the Chinese? Would they have been able to withstand them? Would they have retreated? Would history have been completely different? Very likely, because I don't think they could have overtaken the power of the Chinese if the Chinese at that time had continued on the course that they were going on. But instead, they became much more insular and isolated, and they really kept to the mainland and did not do these major, transoceanic voyages anymore, incredibly enough. And there are lots of different explanations for it, but one of them is that China has much of its own natural resources and for that time and could be self-sufficient. And it might have been a time of economic hardship, and people there may have said, we don't need to spend all this money on this fleet. It's kind of like when you hear people say, why are we spending money on, the space shuttle, or, developing spaceships that can go to Mars? Do we really need to be doing that? We have our own issues here on planet Earth, in the United States. So it could have been something like that, where they decided to shut it down. And that, of course, is going to give the Portuguese the big opening where they can go to the exact areas that the Chinese had gone coming from the other direction. So the Portuguese are going to come up here to the coast and do exactly this. They're going to first get to the Malabar coast in India, and then off they go through the Strait of Malacca, South China Sea, and eventually they're going to reach this area. So it's a real turnaround that occurs at that time. Stop me if you have any questions, by the way. All right, let's see what else we can get to. So I want to show you the differences between ships in 1431 and 1492. So this would have been one of the ships that was part of Zheng He's treasure fleet. These were enormous ships. These were cargo vessels, and they grew their own food. They had lots of room for cargo and crew. They were tremendous. This was one of the ships that Columbus would have sailed across the Atlantic. Now, it's not really apples to apples, because this wasn't a cargo ship. This was a ship that was made to be maneuverable. But with that said, the Europeans would not have had the technology to build something as grand as this in the 1430s, let alone 1492. There's no way that they would have done that. So there was a lot of catching up that they would eventually do because of the pullout of the Chinese in the early 1400s. So a lot of changes are in the works. So let's talk. I know we don't have much time, so I want to just show you a couple of other things here. And one of the things that's going to be instrumental for the Western Europeans to get in on the act in the spice trade and in general oceanic trade is borrowing ideas from Arabian sailors. And one of them is called the dhow. This is a boat that was developed, I'm going to go back for a second, in this area of today's Yemen. This would have been a major center of trade, just like we were talking about Djibouti earlier. Well, here we are. So Yemen would have been a purveyor of stuff coming from this direction to up here. They developed the perfect boat for the ocean, for the Indian Ocean, and that was the dhow. This looks a lot like the sailing ships of Western Europe, and it's because this ship went up the Red Sea. I'll back up for a second. And it's going to go to Alexandria, and the Venetians are going to copy it when they go to Alexandria. And from the Venetians having that ship, the Portuguese are going to copy it from the Venetians. And actually, here's another great origin of a word. We call this sail today, this triangular sail, a lateen sail. And the reason why it's called that is that it was the Portuguese way of saying Latin, because they thought of the Venetians as the Latins, because they were coming from Italy, where, you know, it was the root of Latin. So that's why today it's called a Latin. But this actually is an Arabian sail that the Venetians borrowed, and then the Portuguese borrowed as well. So it's just kind of this thing that gets handed down from one group to another. And there is another picture of a dhow that's going to transform into the types of ships that Columbus is going to use to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Okay. And I'm just going to show you one other thing, and then I'm going to go out of the share and see if anyone has any other questions. So I just want to show you how powerful the Venetians were at their time before they get displaced by the Portuguese. So the Venetians were in the perfect spot, whoops, right over here, to be the recipient of all kinds of stuff coming not only from the overland Silk Road, but also from the maritime Silk Road, because these were colonies that they had where they could pick up things from the Black Sea, but they also had an exclusive contract with Alexandria. So either way, they were able to capture the goods, the luxury items, and bring them all the way up here. So you could use a boat into kind of this interior of Europe. It's much better than having a port down here. They got all the way up there by boat with all of the goods. And then from there, they usually would ship them out over lands throughout Western Europe and charge an enormous profit. So all of these things work together to really change things and prompt Europe to become as powerful as it was going to be. All right, I'm going to get out of this now and see if anybody has any questions, comments, things, ideas that have come up.